Claire Whitmore, and let me tell you a story. My story. The story of the day I was erased. For 12 years, I built a life I thought was ours. I chose the marble countertops in our kitchen. I hosted dinners that sealed Daniel's business deals. I kept the house running, the wine stocked, the conversations flowing. And in all that time, I truly believed, that love meant partnership until the locks changed, until the woman who opened the door wore my bathrobe, until my name vanished from the deed. That was the day Daniel decided I no longer existed, not as his wife, not as his partner, not even as a human being with rights or worth. To him, I was a line item to be written off, a nuisance to be quietly discarded. With a prenup he thought would protect every cent he'd ever touched, he thought he'd won. But here's the thing about women like me, about women you spend years underestimating. We remember, we learn, we endure, and when the moment comes, we fight back. This is not a story of vengeance. It's a story of reclaiming, of standing in a courtroom with nothing but the truth and the fire it ignites. So if you think this is another tale of a discarded housewife, think again. I was erased, and now I'm rewriting every single line. Chapter 1. The day he erased me. It had started like any other Tuesday. I had gone to meet Jessica, my attorney, to review Daniel's proposed settlement, if you could call it that. I'd come home late in the afternoon, arms full of groceries, only to find my key wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. I pressed the doorbell, hands beginning to tremble. Footsteps echoed inside, the door opened, and there she stood, Megan, his assistant, his mistress, wearing my robe. Her smile flickered, unsure. "Oh, Claire, I didn't think you'd be home." I couldn't even speak. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. I looked past her into the foyer that used to be mine. Our framed photos were gone. The console table was bare. The place smelled like a different perfume, not mine. Before I could gather a word, she added, "Daniel said you wouldn't be needing access anymore." I gripped the door frame. "Move," I whispered. My voice didn't sound like mine. Reluctantly, she stepped aside. I pushed in, eyes scanning the room, the dining table, the bar cart, all rearranged. Pieces of my life scrubbed out. I stormed toward Daniel's study. Of course, he wasn't there. A note, typed in cold, waited on the desk. "Claire, per our agreement and the terms of the prenup, you'll retain your personal effects and vehicle. The property and its contents are to remain with me. You'll find the necessary documents with my attorney. Daniel." That was it. 12 years reduced to 4 clinical sentences. I sank into the leather chair, his chair, barely breathing, my pulse hammered. I should have seen this coming. The dinners he canceled, the trips without me, the nights at his downtown condo. But to lock me out of my own home? It wasn't a home anymore. It was his house. The sound of Megan's nervous shuffle in the hallway brought me back. I stood, composed my voice. "Get out," I said softly. But I said, "Get out." She hesitated for a beat too long. I grabbed my phone and dialed Jessica. "Jessica?" I managed, voice shaking. "He changed the locks." There was a pause, then her voice, calm and cutting. "Meet me at my office, now." An hour later, I sat in Jessica's office, hands wrapped around a mug of tea I couldn't drink. She studied the prenup Daniel's team had provided, the same one I'd stupidly signed 12 years ago, too in love to read the fine print. "You said you never had a full copy," Jessica asked. I shook my head. "He kept it in the safe. I trusted him." Jessica's mouth pressed into a thin line. Then, with measured care, she opened her portfolio and slid out an older, original copy. One her investigator had obtained from Daniel's former law firm. "Claire," she said, her tone sharpening, "I need you to read something." She flipped to page 7, her manicured finger landing on a paragraph halfway down. "In the event The marriage continues for a period exceeding 10 years. This agreement shall be deemed null and void, and all marital assets shall be subject to equitable distribution under Illinois state law. I blinked, reread it, again. What does this mean? It means, Jessica said, her smile slow and deliberate, Daniel's ironclad prenup expired 2 years ago. I couldn't breathe. 12 years he had me believe he held all the power. 12 years I'd built a life while he crafted an exit. But now I held the one thing he never thought I'd find. I sat back, air rushing in, my pulse steadied, my mind cleared. What do we do? I asked, my voice stronger now. Jessica's eyes gleamed. We let him think he's already won, and then we turn the page. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and sat on the edge of what was once our bed, staring out at the city skyline beyond the balcony window. The lights of downtown Chicago blinked faintly against the early gray. I wrapped my cardigan tighter, even though the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather. 12 years. That's how long I'd been Claire Whitmore, wife of Daniel Whitmore, hostess, advisor, decorator, emotional buffer, PR fixer, arm candy when needed, ghost when not. And in return, I got a Honda, some luggage, and a key that no longer worked. I stood in the kitchen, his kitchen now, running my fingers along the marble countertop I had picked out during our renovation 5 years ago. Daniel had complained about the price until one of his partners complimented it at a dinner party. Then, suddenly, it was his idea, like everything else. The memory of last night, Megan in my robe, the locks, that smug letter, flashed again in my mind, this time replaced by Jessica's words. The prenup expired 2 years ago. I whispered it like a prayer, like a secret spell no one else knew. That was when I heard the front door open, footsteps. Confident, casual, Daniel. I didn't even need to look to know. He walked in dressed in his running gear, his expensive watch, gleaming on his wrist, AirPods in hand, water bottle tucked under one arm like he owned the morning, and for the last 12 years, he had. He paused when he saw me standing in the kitchen. Surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by irritation. "You're still here?" he asked, already moving past me toward the fridge. "I live here," I replied, the words quiet but firm. "For now," he muttered. "About that, we need to talk." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He didn't notice, or didn't care. "My lawyer wants this house on the market by June," he said while unscrewing the water bottle cap. "So you should start looking for a place." "I assume Jessica told you your options are limited." He grinned, like it was all just a polite business deal. I didn't flinch. "Actually, she thinks the prenup might not be enforceable." He choked slightly on the water. "Excuse me," I shrugged. "Apparently, some provisions are questionable." Daniel scoffed. "Claire, come on. Don't make this messy. You know what we agreed to. You signed it." I was 27. "And in love," I replied. He rolled his eyes. "You were compensated for your contributions. You lived well. You traveled. You didn't work full-time." I stared at him, the rage rising slow and deliberate like smoke. "I gave up my career so you could have yours," I said, my voice low. "I rebuilt your confidence after that IPO tanked. I edited your decks at 2 a.m. I turned your clients into friends. I held this life together." He took a deep breath, clearly annoyed I wasn't being reasonable. Then, with that practiced, patronizing tone he used when he was tired of explaining things to people he thought beneath him, he added, "You're still young. You can start over. I'm trying to be generous." There it was. His generosity, the mask of magnanimity used to wrap a knife. I didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, I smiled. "How kind of you." He blinked at the tone. Something in my expression unsettled him, and that was the first time I saw it. Just a flicker. Doubt. Later that afternoon, Jessica and I sat across from each other in her downtown office, a folder filled with evidence. Bank transfers, contracts, old emails, spread between us. I want to make this very clear, she said, tapping the document. If we use page 7, it becomes war. He'll fight back with everything he has. He'll get aggressive, brutal. I nodded. Let him. Jessica paused. Then we need to let him keep thinking he's won. Just a little longer. I leaned back in the chair, eyes on the ceiling. I could already see the moves playing out. Daniel preparing to sell the house, moving assets, parading Megan through our social circles as if he'd simply upgraded. Then let's give him the spotlight, I said quietly. Let him believe he's center stage. Jessica closed the file. And when the curtain falls, I met her gaze, cold, calm. We'll be the ones holding the script. That night, as I packed a small overnight bag, a notification buzzed on my phone. Text from Daniel. Be reasonable, Claire. Don't drag this out. You have no cards to play. I stared at it for a long time before typing back. Then I stopped. No, let him wonder. Let him feel, for once, what it's like to be unsure. What do you think Claire should do next? Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay with us for the next chapter. Chapter 2. The name on the paper. Page 7 is our weapon, but only if he never sees it coming. Jessica's words echoed in my head as I stared at the glowing skyline outside her office window. The city looked cold tonight. Steel and glass towers piercing the sky, their windows flickering like 1,000 watchful eyes. Chicago could be merciless, but I was learning that so could I. I had spent the last 12 years believing that Daniel was the one who knew everything, the one who controlled the details, the money, the narrative. But now there was a page he hadn't read, and it had my name written all over it. Still, knowing was one thing, using it was another. Jessica leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes never leaving mine. You understand the strategy, Claire. We don't show our hand yet. We let him keep playing King of the Hill while we dig deeper. I nodded slowly. How long do we wait? Long enough for him to commit, she said. The more he asserts that the prenup protects him, the harder it'll be for him to backtrack when we expose page 7. I glanced down at the document again, the crisp legal text that had once sealed my fate and now held the key to my freedom. I still can't believe you didn't catch this, I murmured. Jessica's smile was thin, almost pitying. Men like Daniel don't bother reading the fine print when they think they've already won. When I returned to the house, no, his house, I found Daniel sitting in the study, a glass of scotch in one hand, a stack of real estate listings in the other. He barely looked up as I entered. I assume Jessica told you your options are limited, he said without preamble, but I want this to be amicable, Claire. If you move out quickly, I'll even cover your first month's rent. I nearly laughed. He really thought I was still playing the role of the agreeable, grateful wife. Instead, I smiled. That's very generous of you. He glanced at me then, finally, fully. There was suspicion in his eyes now, a faint crease of uncertainty. Good. I've got a dinner with the Caldwells tonight, he added, standing. Try not to be here when I get back. His words were casual, but the implication was clear. He wanted to erase me from this space entirely, from this life. I watched him leave without another word, and I smiled again, this time for myself. The next morning, I met Margaret at the Art Institute of Chicago. The museum was a sanctuary. Among the canvases and sculptures, I could breathe again. Margaret greeted me with her usual warmth, though there was something sharper in her gaze today. I heard about the locks, she said quietly as we walked through the modern wing, and about everything else, I exhaled slowly. It's not over yet, she nodded. I knew it wouldn't be. Then, after a pause, she added, the director position for special collections, still open, and it's yours if you want it. I stopped walking. Margaret? You need something that's yours again, Claire, she said firmly. You always should have had it. For a moment, my throat tightened. I thought of the years I'd spent shelving my ambitions to support Daniel's, of the projects I'd declined, the exhibitions I'd watched from the sidelines, and I thought of page 7. I squared my shoulders. I won it. Margaret smiled, a flash of genuine pride. Good. We'll make it official next month. That afternoon, Jessica and I met again to review our next steps. Daniel's preparing to list the house, she said. He thinks he's cornered you. He's wrong, I said simply. Jessica tapped the prenup on the table. Then we stay the course. No signals, no threats. Let him walk right into it. I nodded, resolve settling deep in my chest. Daniel might have erased my name from the deed, but there was still a name on the paper that mattered, and soon it would be the one that ended his game. I left Jessica's office that afternoon with a strange new steadiness in my stride. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't walking away from something, I was walking toward it. Toward war, perhaps, but it would be on my terms now. I drove back to the house in silence, letting the rhythm of the city pulse through me. Horns, footsteps, the distant hum of the L. Chicago was always alive, and somewhere in that constant hum, I began to feel alive again, too. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked out front. A sleek silver convertible, top down despite the chill. A pit opened in my stomach. I already knew who it belonged to. Megan. I gripped the steering wheel for a beat longer than necessary, then I released it, gathered my bag, and walked up the steps. Inside, their laughter hit me before I even reached the kitchen. I paused in the hallway, listening. "Oh, Daniel!" Megan was giggling, her voice light and false. "You're terrible!" He chuckled, the sound low and indulgent. "You'll learn." I took a deep breath, smoothed my expression, and entered. There they were, Daniel leaning casually against the kitchen island, Megan perched on a stool, a glass of my favorite wine in hand. My charcuterie board, the one from our honeymoon in Napa, sat between them, loaded with cheese and fruit. For one blinding second, I wanted to smash the entire scene into shards, but I didn't. I smiled instead. "Daniel," I said lightly. I didn't realize we had guests. His head jerked up, surprise flashing before he masked it with a smirk. "Claire, I thought you'd be out." "Clearly not." I set my keys on the counter with deliberate calm. "Hello, Megan," her smile faltered. "Mrs. Whitmore," I corrected softly. "Actually, Novak. I've reclaimed my maiden name." Daniel's jaw tightened. We were just leaving. I glanced at the wine glasses, the spread, the casual intimacy of it all. "Of course," I said. "Though I imagine your lawyer would advise against entertaining your girlfriend here before the divorce is finalized." That landed. Megan flushed. Daniel straightened. "We're not doing anything wrong," he snapped. I tilted my head. "I never said you were. Just that appearances matter." Megan stood abruptly. "Daniel, maybe we should go?" His eyes darted between us. "We're fine." But he was rattled. I could see it now, beneath the polished surface. A crack. Good. Later that evening, I met Margaret for dinner at a quiet restaurant in Lincoln Park. The warmth of the place wrapped around me like a balm. "You handled that beautifully," she said after I relayed the afternoon's events. I wasn't sure I could. I stirred my tea, but when I saw them there, I realized I didn't care about him anymore. Not like that. Margaret smiled. "That's power, Claire. Real power." Her words settled into me, and when she leaned forward, her tone shifted. "There's more," she said. "Alexander and Camille Whitman are hosting a small gathering next week. They specifically asked if you'd be attending." I blinked. "They asked about me?" Margaret nodded. "They've always valued you, Claire. You're more than Daniel's wife to them, and—" She hesitated. "They're looking for someone to consult on their Franklin Theater restoration project." The air caught in my lungs. The Franklin Theater. one of Chicago's oldest Art Deco landmarks, recently acquired by the Whitmans for preservation. "That's incredible," I whispered. "They want you, Claire, not Daniel, you." I sat back, pulse racing, not from fear, but from something fiercer. Purpose. "I'd be honored," I said. Margaret's smile widened. "I'll let them know." When I returned home that night, the house was empty. Daniel had taken Megan elsewhere, perhaps to parade her before another round of clients. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city pulse. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Be reasonable, Claire. You have no cards to play." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I smiled. The kind of smile that comes when you know something they don't. No reply. Let him sweat. The game is only getting started. What do you think Claire's next move should be? Share your guesses below and keep watching. Chapter 3, The Woman He Underestimated. I was the woman who smiled at his clients, remembered their wives' names, the perfect accessory. Now I was the threat he couldn't see coming. There's something dangerous about being overlooked for too long. It sharpens you, quietly, precisely. Daniel had spent over a decade training me to shrink. Behind his success, beside his ego, beneath his name, I played the perfect partner, and he mistook it for weakness. He mistook me for weakness. He wouldn't make that mistake much longer. After Jessica's message about the possible emergency hearing, I didn't panic. I planned. While Daniel focused on rushing the sale of the house, I focused on documenting everything. Emails, texts, handwritten notes, bank statements. Every time he credited me for a business connection, every moment he admitted casually, offhandedly, that I had been part of his rise, he'd said it often, to his partners, to friends over wine, even in thank you cards. I just never thought I'd need to collect them like ammunition. But now I was building a case, not just for court, for myself. The next morning, I sat at the dining table, my laptop open, a yellow legal pad filled with bullet points beside me. Across the room, sun streamed through the windows onto the floors I'd picked out from a reclaimed hardwood supplier in Michigan. Daniel had once scoffed at the cost, until one of his investor friends had complimented it. Then it was our great design choice. I didn't flinch when I heard his footsteps upstairs. He was packing for a business trip to New York. I knew the schedule. I had managed it for years. He came downstairs with a suitcase and that smug sense of efficiency he wore like cologne. "I'll be gone 2 nights," he said, not looking at me. "Megan will be staying at her place." I looked up, eyebrows raised. "Thank you for the update." He paused, sensing the shift in my tone, but too distracted to press. "Oh," he added like an afterthought. "Whitman's called. Camille and Alexander. They've agreed to a meeting next week. Should be promising." I held his gaze for a beat too long. "That's great," I said. "Give them my regards." He smiled, mistaking my calm for civility. "Will do." And just like that, he was gone. 3 hours later, I stood in front of the Whitman's brownstone in Gold Coast. Margaret had arranged the lunch. I was early. Not professionally early. Intentionally early. Camille opened the door herself, dressed effortlessly elegant, her eyes warm. "Claire?" she said, ushering me in. "We've missed you." Inside, the dining table was set for 3. Sunlight bathed the room in a soft golden hush. It smelled like rosemary and lemon and safety. Alexander entered from the study. "So good to see you again." We sat, and conversation flowed. At first, light. Art, architecture, travel. Then it drifted organically toward the Franklin Theater. "We've finalized the acquisition," Camille said, "and we're looking for someone to lead the historical consultation." My breath caught, but I kept my face composed. "It's an incredible space," Alexander nodded, "which is why we'd like you to join us. You're the only one we trust to balance historical accuracy with vision." I hadn't expected it to be so direct, so clear. Camille leaned forward slightly. We know Daniel will be upset when he finds out, but let's be honest, his involvement was always through you. Something in me cracked open. Recognition, validation. I'd be honored, I said, voice steady. Camille smiled. I'll have our team send over the details. We moved to the living room, talked long after lunch ended. Not just about the project, but about what came after. Camille confided her own past. An early divorce, the years it took to reclaim herself. People think starting over is a weakness, she said, but it's the strongest thing you'll ever do. And in that moment, I knew something Daniel never would. I wasn't his shadow. I was my own name on the paper now. I walked home from the Whitmans with the faint ache of something unfamiliar blooming in my chest. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. For the first time in over a decade, I felt like a woman with leverage. Not borrowed influence, not Daniel's title, his client list, or his shadow, but my own. My experience, my education, my voice. The same things he'd once praised when they served him and dismissed when they didn't. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt firmer somehow. I clutched the manila folder Camille had given me. Project specs, timelines, a short handwritten note. We trust your vision. I had to stop myself from rereading those words again and again. Inside the house, I found the silence almost soothing. No Megan, no Daniel, just me. I set the folder down, rolled up my sleeves, and pulled open the antique filing cabinet in Daniel's office. The one he kept mostly for show. I had no illusions he used it often. He was a man of digital clouds and sleek apps. But I wasn't looking for anything recent. I was looking for proof. Emails I had printed over the years, correspondence where Daniel had credited me for key networking breakthroughs. Handwritten notes from clients who had thanked me, not him, for making introductions, smoothing tensions, helping land difficult accounts. I pulled a stack from the bottom drawer, and there it was, a birthday card from Barbara Caldwell, handwritten in thick blue ink. Claire, thank you for remembering our anniversary dinner. You saved us both, and Daniel's pitch would have flopped without your calm advice afterward. We're lucky to know you. My breath hitched. The date on the card was nearly 7 years ago. I snapped a photo and filed it into my digital evidence folder, then kept going. Receipts from business dinners I had hosted, handwritten agendas I had drafted. I knew what Jessica needed, a timeline, paper trail, quantifiable input that pointed to more than just wife duties. She wanted demonstrable value. I had plenty of it. He just never thought I'd think to keep it, but that was always Daniel's flaw. He believed that because I didn't demand credit, I didn't deserve it. By evening, my workspace had become a mosaic of documentation, scanned pages, annotated notes, bullet points. I sent Jessica a compressed file with the subject line, Proof of Contribution, Phase 1. Her reply came within the hour. This is gold. Let's talk strategy tomorrow. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion creeping in, but underneath it, a quiet thrill pulsed through me. I was building something solid. Not just a case, but a foundation, a life that didn't need Daniel's name to stand. The next morning, I met Margaret for coffee before heading to the museum. She glanced at me as I approached, eyes narrowing with a curious smile. You look different, she said. I feel different, I replied, sliding into the chair. She nodded. That's how it starts. You remember who you are before you were quieted. Her words sat with me all morning as I stood in the museum's empty west wing, staring at an exhibit I once curated but was never credited for. The spotlight had always landed on Daniel, the charming, powerful husband. I had simply made sure the frame was hung straight and the lighting flattering. Not anymore. That afternoon, as I was organizing the new files Jessica requested, my phone buzzed to a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. Claire Whitmore? A woman asked, her voice cautious. Yes, this is Andrea. I used to work at Whitmore and Stein. I was Daniel's assistant before Megan. I went completely still. I'm calling because I heard you might be going to court, and her voice dropped. There are some things you should know about how he moved money and when I nearly dropped the phone. Would you be willing to meet? She asked. I swallowed. Yes. When? Soon, she said. Before he buries it all. Claire just uncovered a secret. One Daniel never saw coming. What do you think she'll do next? Stay tuned. Chapter 4. The Witness Who Turned Back. He brought her into my house. Now I'll bring the truth into the courtroom. That sentence played on a loop in my mind as I sat across from Jessica in her office the following morning. The call from Andrea had changed everything. I hadn't slept well the night before. My mind had been racing, piecing together fragments of conversations, suspicious movements in our accounts, offhand remarks Daniel had made when he thought I wasn't listening. Jessica tapped her pen against her legal pad. This is huge, Claire. If Andrea can provide credible evidence that Daniel was moving assets while married, while claiming you'd get nothing, that's game over. I nodded. She said she'd meet today. She sounded scared. She should be. Jessica's tone was blunt. Men like Daniel don't like loose ends. I exhaled slowly. Do we tell him we know? Not yet. Jessica leaned forward. The more secure he feels, the sloppier he'll get. Later that afternoon, I met Andrea at a quiet cafe in West Loop. I spotted her instantly. Nervous energy wrapped in an oversized trench coat, sunglasses pushed up in her hair despite the overcast sky. Claire, she said softly, sliding into the booth. Thank you for coming, I replied. She glanced around, then leaned in. I only have a few minutes. He's paranoid, always was, and with his divorce, he's been worse. I steadied my voice. You said you know about the money. Andrea nodded quickly. He started transferring funds about a year ago, little amounts at first, just enough to fly under the radar. He set up accounts in his brother's name, Delaware. Offshore, too. My pulse quickened. And you saw this? I helped process some of the transfers. Her hands twisted the edge of her napkin. Back then, I thought it was for tax purposes. But when I heard he's claiming the prenup still locks you out of everything, she shook her head. Claire, he's trying to gut the accounts before the court can see them. I swallowed hard. Would you be willing to testify? Andrea hesitated, biting her lip. I don't want to get pulled into a war. I forced myself to stay calm. I understand, but if you don't, he'll get away with it. He'll do this to the next person, to anyone who stands in his way. Andrea looked down at her coffee for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll do it. But I want protection. I'll make sure Jessica handles it, I promised. Andrea slid a flash drive across the table. Everything I saved, I knew this day might come. I closed my fingers around it, pulse hammering. Thank you. She stood quickly. Be careful, Claire. He's not the man you married. I already knew that. I rushed straight to Jessica's office, adrenaline surging. When I handed her the flash drive, her eyes lit with a rare spark of triumph. This is it, she said. We don't just have page 7 anymore. We have a pattern of financial misconduct. She slotted the drive into her laptop, scanning file after file, wire transfers, account statements, emails from Daniel to his brother with explicit instructions. He thought deleting this from his servers would cover him, Jessica murmured, but Andrea was smarter. A weight lifted off my chest. What now? We file for emergency discovery, Jessica said. Force him to open all financials, officially. Will that tip him off? Jessica smiled thinly. Oh, yes, but by then it will be too late. I leaned back in the chair, tension melting into cold resolve. Daniel had thought he could bring his girlfriend into my house and erase my name from his life. But now I was bringing receipts to court, and the house he'd built on lies was about to crumble. The next 48 hours moved like a war plan in motion. Jessica's team worked with surgical precision, preparing the emergency motion for discovery, verifying every document Andrea had provided, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and shell accounts. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel had been draining assets with intent long before he uttered the word divorce over our Tuesday night dinner. Intent mattered. The court would see that. I spent those hours in a state of tawny readiness, not fear, no, not anymore, but a simmering resolve that kept me sharp, focused. When Jessica called late Thursday evening, I answered on the first ring. "We're filing first thing in the morning," she said. "This is airtight." I exhaled. "And he'll find out." "Soon," Jessica confirmed, "which means now is the time to remind the social circle exactly who you are." I blinked. "You mean, go to the Whitman's gathering. Be seen, be calm, be publicly unshakable. Let him see the ground shifting under his feet, without knowing why." That night, I stood in front of my closet, the same one where Daniel had insisted wear the appropriate designers for his events, the right hues for photographs, the silhouettes that flattered his brand of success. But this was no longer about his brand. I chose a deep emerald dress, structured, elegant, commanding, a dress I had once set aside for fear of upstaging him. Tonight, I would not shrink. When I arrived at the Whitman's townhouse, the air was already charged. Chicago's old money mixed with new, investors and patrons mingling beneath the crystal chandeliers. Camille greeted me with a warm hug. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered. Alexander joined us moments later. "You look radiant, Claire." I smiled genuinely for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Thank you." As the evening unfolded, I moved through the crowd with purpose, not as Daniel's discarded wife, but as Claire Novak Whitmore, future director of special collections, lead consultant on the Franklin Theater restoration. I caught familiar eyes widening, subtle glances exchanged. The unspoken question hung in the air. Was she supposed to be here? Yes, and I would be present in every room, Daniel thought. He'd claimed. Halfway through the evening, I stepped onto the terrace for air. That's when I heard his voice behind me. "Well, you do know how to make an entrance." I turned, slow and deliberate. Daniel stood there, scotch in hand, Megan at his side. Her smile brittle, her eyes scanning for support that wasn't there. I tilted my head. I was invited. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're pushing this further than it needs to go, Claire." "I'm simply maintaining my relationships," I replied. "Isn't that what you always taught me?" His eyes flashed. "You won't win this. The prenup is clear." I took a step closer, voice low. "Are you sure you've read all of it?" For a split second, just a flicker. Uncertainty crossed his face. Then it vanished beneath his practiced arrogance. "Careful," he said coldly. "You don't want to make an enemy of me." I smiled. "Daniel, I didn't make you my enemy. You did that all by yourself." Megan tugged at his sleeve. "Daniel, let's go." He hesitated, then followed her inside, shoulders taut. I watched them retreat, heart steady. He was rattled. He still thought the prenup was his shield. He didn't know about page 7. And he certainly didn't know about Andrea. The next morning, Jessica and I filed the motion in court. The clerk confirmed the judge would review it within 24 hours. As I left the courthouse, my phone buzzed, a text from Jessica. "He knows we filed. Expect a reaction." And it came, faster than I imagined. That afternoon, a courier delivered a new letter from Daniel's lawyer. Jessica called me as soon as she received it. "He is trying to force an expedited settlement," she said, "suddenly offering much more than before." I laughed. "Sharp, bitter, he's scared." "Exactly," Jessica said. "And now we let him sweat. Claire's fight is just beginning. What do you think will happen next? Stay tuned. The next chapter may surprise you." Chapter 5. The Room He Never Locked. The one thing Daniel never controlled was my memory. I've always remembered details, It was both a habit and a necessity, an invisible skill cultivated over years spent smoothing edges for Daniel, anticipating moods, recalling names and dates that he never bothered to remember himself. And now that memory was about to become my sharpest weapon. Jessica's voice from the night before still echoed in my mind. We let him sweat. But I knew we needed more than that. We needed to drown him in his own carelessness. Daniel was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. With the emergency motion filed, he'd already started scrambling. Offering settlements, sending veiled threats. That meant one thing. Somewhere in this house there was proof he hadn't yet buried. And I was going to find it. The house was empty again. Daniel had taken an emergency trip to New York, likely to confer with his lawyers in person. Megan was nowhere to be seen. I walked through the rooms slowly, absorbing each familiar space that now felt alien. The bedroom, once warm, now sterile. The living room rearranged to suit her tastes. The study, untouched. That was where I paused. Daniel's study was his sanctuary. I rarely entered without invitation, not because he forbade it outright, but because it was his unspoken domain, a space where he spun deals and manipulated narratives, where he built the image of Daniel Whitmore, the mogul, the untouchable. But he had forgotten one thing. He'd never actually locked me out. I opened the door, inhaling the faint scent of leather, old whiskey, and cedar polish. The heavy desk dominated the room, stacked neatly with portfolios and decoy files he'd want any casual observer to see. But I wasn't casual. Not anymore. I sat behind the desk, fingertips brushing the cool mahogany. Then I began methodically opening drawers, flipping through folders, scanning the surfaces with the eyes of a woman who no longer cared about permission. Most of what I found was standard fare: property listings, meeting agendas, superficial correspondence. But when I reached the bottom drawer on the left, my heart caught a thin black binder, unlabeled. I pulled it out and flipped it open. Inside, photocopies, contracts, the prenup in full, including page 7, with both of our initials in clear blue ink. I traced the faded lines with my fingertip, breath shallow. Here is the original version, untouched, incontrovertible. I snapped a picture with my phone, then carefully photographed each page in sequence. Daniel hadn't even thought to remove it. Perhaps because he believed I would never look here. Or perhaps because he had told himself so many times that the prenup was ironclad that he no longer questioned it. That was his mistake. I kept searching. Behind the binder, tucked between old property files, I found a manila envelope marked private. Inside were scanned copies of correspondence between Daniel and a former lawyer, the one he'd fired years ago, long before bringing in Berkowitz. One email thread stood out. Sunset clause. Need clarification. Date, 8 years ago. Daniel had known about page 7, and he had chosen not to tell me. I swallowed hard, forcing down the rising wave of anger. This wasn't the time for emotion. It was time for precision. I scanned the documents quickly, photographing everything, then returned them exactly as I'd found them. No evidence of disturbance, no reason for Daniel to know what I now held. An hour later, I sat across from Jessica in her office once more. Her eyes widened as I slid my phone across the desk. She scrolled through the images in silence, then leaned back with a slow, deliberate smile. "He knew," she said simply. "Yes," I whispered. "And he counted on me never knowing." Jessica exhaled. "This changes everything. Not only do we have the clause, we can prove intent." He concealed it. That's material. A thrill of cold satisfaction coursed through me. I wasn't the woman who smiled quietly at dinner parties anymore. I was the woman who could bring down the empire he thought he built alone. Jessica sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, eyes gleaming as she scrolled once more through the photos on my phone. "He knew," she said again, as if savoring the words. "This isn't just about the clause anymore. It's about deception. About fraud. I exhaled slowly. The weight of that truth pressed hard against my chest, not from fear, but from the staggering scope of Daniel's betrayal. He hadn't merely failed, mentioned page 7. He had known. He had actively sought advice about it, fired the lawyer who flagged it, then allowed me to believe I was trapped under its terms. I clenched my hands in my lap. What's our next move? Jessica's smile was razor sharp. We bring this to the judge at the emergency hearing, with the financial misconduct and this, she tapped the screen. He doesn't stand a chance, but first, let him walk further into the trap. My voice was steady now. How? We give no hint. When Berkowitz responds to our motion, they'll have to formally reaffirm the prenup's validity. The more they double down, the more their position collapses when we reveal this. I nodded. I'm ready. Jessica's gaze softened slightly. You've come a long way, Clara. I looked her straight in the eye. I'm not here just to win. I'm here to reclaim who I am. She smiled, this time with a flicker of genuine warmth. Then, let's finish this. Over the next 2 days, I prepared, not just legally, but mentally. I combed through every document I had collected, refining the timeline Jessica would present. I practiced my testimony, ensuring my voice would not waver when the moment came. But more than that, I centered myself. I walked through the Art Institute's grand halls, letting the weight of centuries of art ground me. I spent quiet hours sketching in the Franklin Theater's empty lobby, imagining its rebirth. For the first time in years, I was building a life that was mine, not Daniel's, not one constructed to orbit his success. The evening before the emergency hearing, I returned home to an unexpected sight, Daniel's car in the driveway. I entered quietly, heart steady. He stood in the study, poring over papers with a scowl. He didn't hear me at first. When he did, he straightened, mask snapping into place. Claire, he said coolly, you've been busy. I tilted my head. Have I? He stalked toward me, paper in hand. A newly drafted settlement offer. I'm increasing the offer, he said. Sign it now, and this all goes away. You walk with enough to live comfortably, and we spare ourselves. The circus. I met his gaze evenly. Why the sudden generosity? His eyes flickered. You know why. He didn't say it, but he suspected. I let a small smile play at my lips. Daniel, I appreciate the gesture, but I'll take my chances with the court. His jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. No, I said softly. You did. Later that night, as I packed a small leather portfolio for court, my phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. His team filed their They reaffirmed the prenup, fully. No mention of page 7. They've walked right into it. I closed my eyes for a beat, pulse thrumming. It was happening. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of my tailored navy suit, the one I had bought for my museum interview, not for Daniel, not for anyone else, for me. I met my own gaze and whispered aloud, I was never his shadow. I was always the light. With the courtroom battle about to begin, what do you think Claire's next move will be? Stay tuned. The next chapter is one you won't want to miss. Chapter 6. The House That Stands. He thought I would crumble. Instead, I stood taller than ever, in his court, in his world. I remember the click of my heels on the marble floor of the courthouse that morning. Each step echoed louder than the last, steady, certain, deliberate. It wasn't the first time I'd walked through those halls, but it was the first time I wasn't shrinking in someone else's shadow. Jessica met me outside the courtroom. Her suit was immaculate, her eyes sharp with quiet fire. You ready? She asked. I met her gaze. More than ever. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The room buzzed with muted conversation as lawyers arranged their files and whispered last-minute strategies. The judge had yet to enter, but already the battle lines were drawn. Daniel sat across from us, perfectly composed in his tailored charcoal suit. His expression was cool, practiced, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his cufflinks. Beside him, Berkowitz leaned in, speaking low and fast. Daniel nodded once, not glancing in my direction. I allowed myself a small smile. He had no idea the ground beneath him was about to crack. The judge entered. A seasoned woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. We rose. The session began. Jessica opened with precision. Your Honor, we are here today because the defendant seeks to enforce a prenuptial agreement that, as we will demonstrate, is not only null and void under its own terms, but has been willfully misrepresented by the defendant to our client. She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. We will also provide evidence of intentional financial misconduct during the period leading up to this proceeding across the aisle. Berkowitz stood. His tone was oily with false confidence. The defense asserts that the prenuptial agreement remains binding and fully enforceable, and that no evidence of misconduct exists beyond the scope of normal financial management. Jessica arched an eyebrow, almost amused. Then, let's proceed, the judge said. As the hearing unfolded, I sat poised, listening as Jessica dismantled their arguments with clinical precision. She introduced Andrea's testimony first. A sworn affidavit detailing Daniel's covert asset transfers, supported by irrefutable transaction records. Berkowitz sputtered, objected, tried to discredit the source, but the document spoke louder than any lawyer. Then came the moment I had waited for. Your Honor, we now present the original, full copy of the prenuptial agreement, specifically page 7. She handed it to the clerk, who delivered it to the judge. Silence fell. The judge read the page, eyes narrowing slightly. She looked up. Counselor, are you prepared to address this clause? Berkowitz paled. Your Honor, the defense was unaware of this provision's existence. Jessica's voice was ice. Yet we have evidence that Mr. Whitmore was not only aware, but sought legal advice regarding this very clause 8 years ago. She produced the email thread I had found. The judge studied it for a long moment. Then she spoke, voice firm. The court finds that the prenuptial agreement's sunset clause renders it unenforceable as of the stated. Furthermore, the concealment of this fact constitutes a material misrepresentation. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying my breath. 12 years of my life. Months of strategy. Weeks of clawing back every piece of truth Daniel thought he'd buried. And now, one clear sentence from the bench had cut through it all. When the gavel finally came down, I didn't cry. I thought I might. I thought some part of me would break open with the release, the vindication. But what I felt wasn't a surge of emotion. It was stillness, the kind that comes after a long, unrelenting storm, the kind that lets you hear yourself breathe again. The judge ruled not only to dismiss Daniel's attempt to enforce the prenup, but also to launch a formal audit of his financial conduct. Jessica told me later that the penalties for intentional concealment in this context could be steep. Civil, maybe even criminal. Daniel didn't look at me as the courtroom emptied. Megan had already left before the ruling, slipping out the side door once the defense began to fall apart. I don't know if she ran because she was afraid or because she realized the empire she'd clung to wasn't hers to inherit. Either way, I didn't follow. Let the wreckage settle without me. A week later, I stood alone in what was once our kitchen. The marble countertops were still flawless, but the energy had changed. It was mine now. Not because a court had declared it so, but because I had reclaimed it piece by piece. I turned the lights on one by one, walked barefoot across the floors he used to brag about, touched the garden door I'd always wanted to replace, and then I sat at the table with a glass of wine, not to toast victory, but to breathe, to begin again. 3 months passed. I took the position with the Whitmans. The Franklin Theater now bore my name in the credits as lead historical consultant. My signature stood on the restoration plaques. My voice opened the gala. People no longer whispered about me as Daniel Whitmore's ex. They asked for me by name. Claire Novak Whitmore. But just when I thought the path had settled, something arrived. A cream envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of thick stationery, typed, anonymous. It read, "You weren't the only one he lied to. Look into the donation dated March 14th, 2017, under Marion Hale. You'll find what he buried." I stared at it, heart suddenly heavy with a different kind of tension. Marion, that name meant nothing to me. Yet, I folded the letter slowly, the edges trembling just slightly between my fingers. Daniel's lies were deeper than I thought. And maybe I wasn't the only woman he tried to erase.